So now that we know about our typical pop song structure, we can talk a little bit about another form of song, which is called a verse-refrain. So a verse-refrain is really common as well, but more common in folk music and in jazz and in old musical theater. Basically, the concept here is that you have your verses, as usual, except that at the end of each verse, you get a specific line that repeats. Just one line usually. And that's the line that holds your main idea. So instead of having your main idea be in one big chorus, you're having it at the end of each line, and it's only that one little bit, so you have to really be concise. The other thing to keep in mind is that you need your listener to be able to interpret things on their own here, which basically means that you have to expect a little bit more of your listener. You want them to really be paying attention, and you want them to be listening and interpreting everything that's being said in the verses. So a couple of really good examples of a verse-refrain in an actual song would be The Wind Cries Mary or Misty. You also see this a lot in Bob Dylan's writing. You see it a lot in Simon & Garfunkel. Basically any genre where you're expecting your listener to be paying attention to the lyrical content. In a pop song, we don't necessarily expect them to be paying attention to all of those specific little details, even though it's really fun to do that, like I just did with Kelly Clarkson. But in a verse-refrain, we really are expected to think about it a little bit more. That's why you do see a lot of poetry-turned-song that uses this form. Early one morning the sun was shining. I was laying in bed, wondering if she changed at all, if her hair was still red. Her folks, they said our lives together sure was gonna be rough. They never did like Mama's homemade dress. Papa's bank book wasn't big enough. And I was standing on the side of the road, rain falling on my shoes, heading out for the East Coast. Lord knows I paid some dues getting through. Tangled up in blue. So as you can see in that example, we get a really long verse, which gives us a whole lot of detail about the story. We know that he's lying in bed, it's early one morning, and he's thinking about a specific person and wondering if her hair is still the same color that it used to be. We then find out that they were likely going to get married, but that the parents weren't super thrilled about it. And then we hear about the rain falling on his shoes, likely after his heart has been broken in some capacity. And then we hear this refrain line, tangled up in blue. To me, I get the image of blue being the rain or blue being the sadness he's feeling in that moment. We then get a lot of other verses, each one telling us a little bit more about the story and kind of where he was at different times and how their paths cross in various points of their lives. So this phrase, tangled up in blue, gives us a lot of continuity. It basically helps us to stay grounded and stay focused in our story. And it kind of changes each time we hear it. We know a little bit more about the characters each time. They've grown a little older or they've experienced something different. So for instance, when she ties the laces of his shoes, you could then hear tangled up in blue as being tangled like laces, whereas before we were thinking tangled like rain. My favorite line in the entire song talks about how she opens a book of poems and hands it to him, and it's this really old book of poems. And then he says, every one of those words rang true and glowed like burning coal, pouring off of every page like it was written in my soul from me to you, tangled up in blue. Right? It's so good. So what I love about that, A, is the sense imagery, right? We get that burning of the coal. But what I love there is the use of the perfect rhyme between you and blue, as well as the imagery of loopy handwriting that I kind of imagine there, right? Because these words felt like they were written in his soul. So you kind of imagine this loopy handwriting and then being tangled in it, which I just absolutely love. Finally, when we get to the end of the song, he says that he's finally going back again because he has to get to her somehow. He says that we always did feel the same, we just saw it from a different point of view, and then uses that perfect rhyme again with view and tangled up in blue. And on that final tangled up in blue, we start to understand that to be tangled up in blue in his mind is to be tangled up with this other person in the lines of their fate. So throughout the song, we get these completely different images of what that phrase, tangled up in blue, could really mean. And I think that's what makes it so powerful each time we hear it and why it gets more intense. So Bob Dylan in particular totally loves this trick to use that verse-refrain form. So you'll hear it in a lot of his songs. It's in Simple Twist of Fate, in one of my favorite songs ever, which is called Most of the Time. You should check it out if you've never heard it. It's beautiful. And I think it really shows that when Bob Dylan writes a song, he's thinking in terms of getting the listener to really pay attention to the lyrics. He wants you to analyze it like poetry. And you'll see the same thing in Paul Simon's writing, and with people like Duke Ellington or Rodgers and Hammerstein. So you'll notice that this song did not have a bridge. But actually a lot of verse-refrain songs do have a bridge, and it really does help to break up the monotony a bit. And a bridge can be used not only to break up the monotony, but to give a different perspective or stop the storytelling for just a moment to add a little bit more exposition or to give us a little bit more of a tell. Another thing that you can do with a verse-refrain song is change the refrain each time. My favorite example of this is The Wind Cries Mary by Jimi Hendrix, in which he uses that phrase, "The wind cries Mary," in the beginning, and then goes ahead and changes it the second time you hear it to "The wind whispers Mary." And then the next time you hear it, it's "The wind screams Mary," until finally you hear it again at the end as "The wind cries Mary." I think this is done really well in this particular song, because using different volumes for the wind makes the wind feel much more personified, and it changes the intensity level very much from verse to verse. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of what a verse-refrain is. When I'm writing a song, the thing that makes me decide between a verse-chorus and a verse-refrain is usually what I want the audience to come away with. If I want my listener to be able to sing along and to have a really good time or to be humming it after they've heard it, a lot of the time I'm going to go for a verse-chorus, especially if it doesn't really bother me whether they get the full meaning of my lyrics in the verses. If, however, I feel really passionately that I want them to understand the story and that I want them to really focus in on the meaning of everything in a very poetic way, that's when I will use a verse-refrain. Keep in mind that these are not the only song forms. You can also have a song that doesn't have a refrain or a chorus. Like, for instance, Simon & Garfunkel's Kathy's song doesn't have either. And really all that it does is uses that pretty cadence at the end of each verse to make sure that you know that it's the end of the verse. So you can do that sort of thing too, but just be wary that your listener might kind of get bored with it at a certain point if your melody isn't super beautiful, like that melody happens to be. You also have to be really aware of the harmony and the way that your melody is shaped so that you can make sure that your listener understands that that's where the end of each verse happens. You can also write a verse-chorus song that has a pre-chorus or doesn't have a pre-chorus or has a bridge or doesn't have a bridge. You can use these song forms as a jumping off point and be able to kind of create your own song form from there. Nothing has to be set in stone. So I hope that this helped you to identify different song forms and to be able to use them in your own writing in whatever context you feel the need to use them. If you have any questions or if you think of any other song forms that you want to know about, please let me know in the comments below. I would love to try to answer them for you. Also be sure to leave a like and to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I would love to see you around here again.